Hello, everybody. My name is Linda Levy, and I'm director of the JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you today to this inaugural public lecture sponsored by the JDC Archives in the context of the Sorrel and Lorraine Chesson JDC Archives Fellowship. I want to extend thanks to Sorrel and Lorraine Chesson, who are with us today, for their generosity in endowing this new fellowship. The JDC Archives, which houses the records of JDC since its inception in 1914, about 102 years ago, is one of the most important repositories in the world for the study of modern Jewish history. Visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, filmmakers, journalists, family researchers, curators, and others. I invite you to visit our wonderful website at archives.jdc.org and to see the online exhibits, peruse our photo collection, use our names index, and research in our online text collections. I'd like to recognize and thank the Center for Jewish History, the co-sponsor of this program today, and invite Dr. Chris Bartel, the Center's Director of Academic Programs, to give greetings.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Center. My name is Chris Barthel, Director of Academic Programs here. And it's our pleasure to be working with the JDC in partnership in today's program. Many of you may already know the Center for its many public programs in Jewish history and culture, and for the Center as home to the 5 partner organizations who are here: American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And the partner collections housed here at the Center are some of the most important, along with the JDC archive collections here in New York City. The partner collections document over 500 years of Jewish history and are used by students, scholars, genealogists, journalists, all sorts of people who are conducting research into modern Jewish history, including those who are working in who have received fellowships from the Center to conduct research here. And I would encourage you, if you have an interest in researching your own family history, to come and take advantage of the Ackman and Ziff Genealogy Institute here. It's an opportunity to explore all of those resources and get some tips on how to explore your family history. So once again, thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed today's program.
I'd like to now tell you a little bit about this fellowship. The Sorrel and Lorraine Chesson JDC Archives Fellowship was established in 2015 with a generous gift from Dr. Sorrel and Lorraine Chesson, supporters of JDC, who have deep roots in the field of higher education, as well as a long-time commitment to academic research and scholarship. The goal of the fellowship is to enable scholars engaged in graduate-level, postdoctoral, or independent research to conduct research in the JDC archives. Our speaker today is Dr. Michal Frankl. He's the recipient of this fellowship for 2016. Our format is that the guest speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Dr. Michal Frankl is a researcher at the Masaryk Institute and Archives of the Czech Academy of Sciences. Prior to that, he served as deputy director and head of the Department of Jewish Studies and History of Anti-Semitism at the Jewish Museum in Prague, in the Czech Republic. Dr. Frankl's scholarship centers on modern anti-Semitism, refugee policy, and the Holocaust in Czech lands. He has published many works, among them the book Prague is Now Anti-Semitic, Czech Anti-Semitism at the End of the 19th Century. He is the co-author with Katerina Kapkova of the book Uncertain Refuge, Czechoslovakia and its Refugees from Nazi Germany and Austria, 1933 to 1938. Dr. Frankl's expertise also involves the digitization of archival documents and their publication. He serves as a leader of a trans-institutional research guide, a project of the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, or ERI, for those of you who are familiar with it. His research in the JDC New York archives is focused on citizens of the no man's land and the transformation of Jewish citizenship in East and Central Europe in 1935, 1939, and on the role of Jewish aid organizations. This afternoon, he will speak on the topic, No Man's Land, Jewish Refugees on the Border of the East Central Europe in 1938. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michal Frankl.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this very kind introduction. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to speak here today, and I'd like to express my thanks to you, first of all, to the JDC Archives for the fellowship, for their very support, the very friendly atmosphere and kind approach to me. I'd like to say my thank you to the donors, Sorel and Lorraine Chessin, for their very generosity that enables it for me in the first place to cross borders, something that people about whom I'm going to speak were not really able to do. I should also say thanks to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which awarded me a fellowship last year. And what you are going to see today is largely based on my research in Washington, D.C. A year ago. And I hope after the next 2 weeks spent in JDC Archives, I will be able to draw a much richer picture of the refugees' no man's land. And last but not least, thank you to Center for Jewish History for providing such a hospitable place for our talk, and I hope for a rich discussion at the end. And to get us started, I'd like to take us to places that are much less hospitable than Center for Jewish History, namely the no man's land for refugees in and around 1938. I have a person to accompany us, to lead us straight into the no man's land, and that was the Czechoslovak refugee activist and a Zionist activist named Marie Šmolka, or Šmolková in Czech, who in December 1938 reported from the refugee camp established in Mišdorf, or Miloslavov in Slovak. As you can see, my presentation is all map-based. Miloslavov is marked in red. I hope you can see it. It's very close to Bratislava. When Šmolka came there as one of very few relief workers who were led through the new demarcation line, and I'll explain this later, she found more than 300 Jewish refugees stuck in an open field in temperatures below zero, with no equipment, no shelter. And she reported about this. They built scanty huts and roofs from maize stalks and duck pits in which they placed their children. 2 weeks after their forcible arrival, many were still living in provisional self-made huts. They had no chairs, no tables, no possibility to wash. Only seriously ill people could find shelter in 4 furniture vans that were provided by nearby Jewish communities. And Šmolka continued to describe the very misery of their life, saying, lying side by side are cripples who are quite unable to move, a blind woman who is seriously ill, etc., etc. Her powerful rendering of these events is made even stronger by a series of photographs that survived from there. The series was made by a journalist I'm not sure if the journalist visited together with Smolka or on another occasion, but you can see that the no man's land for refugees was basically open field next to road between demarcation lines. Those lingering in Mischdorf and in a similar makeshift camp in Velký Kír, that is close to Nitra, they were only a small part of approximately 7,000 Jews who were expelled hastily by Slovak authorities after the first Vienna Award in November 1938, an event which diplomatic decision which awarded large swaths of southern and eastern Slovakia to Hungary. Upset and feeling humiliated, the Slovak leadership, including President Tiso, and following their anti-Semitic worldview, they moved to eject foreign, but also some Czechoslovak Jews across the new border, just before the territory would be occupied by the Hungarian army. Yet, this was not the first time Smolka was reporting about and from the no man's land for refugees in 1938. In fact, her report reads like a Czechoslovak overview of where and how, during 1938, Jewish refugees became stranded in the border zones between Czechoslovakia and its neighbors. Thus, throughout 1938, a new territory rapidly appeared along the borders of East Central European states. The no man's land were unwanted refugees, mostly persecuted for being Jews or being considered as such, where they were trapped. Small or larger groups of people were forced to camp alongside roads, on fields, in dilapidated buildings, between the border posts, or in internment camps behind the lines. When I started my research, I knew about some of these cases, and a lot of other researchers also documented some of these events. But I was very soon struck by how often I'm finding, when I do research refugees in 1938, how often I find references to the no man's land. The no man's land is something which is very characteristic for the dramatic, fateful events of 1938, and it provides us with a great perspective on how position of Jews and refugees shifted very quickly in this period. In the following, I'm going to offer you two perspectives. The talk will have two parts. In the first one, I'll try to guide you through this new territory, through the territory that nobody would like to visit really or live in, and that's the territory of the no man's land for refugees. This tour will be necessarily sketchy and selective and incomplete. Due to time reasons, I'm not going to be able to provide you with the complete context. And if something would be unclear, I invite you to ask your questions in the Q&A. In the second half, I will try to examine the broader meanings and context of the phenomenon of the no man's land. I'm not going myself refer to current issues with refugees, but apparently you are invited to think about them, and nothing prevents us from touching that in the discussion as well. Shortly after midnight on March 12, 1938, an unusually full train arrived at the Czechoslovak border station of Břeclav, or Lundenburg in German, in the south, again marked in red. Those on board were indeed no usual passengers of a sleepy night train. Most of them had hastily packed the most necessary items after hearing the news of the German troops and of the feared Gestapo approaching towards Vienna. For endangered anti-Nazi activists and for many Jews, the Czechoslovak border seemed to be the best way, and in fact, one of the last escape routes as well, the best way to avoid Nazi rule. Among them was Richard Berman, a journalist and a staunch critic of the Austrian Christian social authoritarian so-called Ständestaat in Austria, 1934 to 1938. And Berman recorded his excitement about the arrival into free Czechoslovakia. He recorded a couple of months later, though. He says, "Finally, I was able to breathe again. We were saved." He therefore found it hard to believe what followed after the train pulled into Břeclav. All refugees were taken out of the train, and after a couple of hours of tense waiting, they were returned to what had in the meantime become Nazi-ruled Austria. Berman, in his recollections, reflected upon and visualized this dramatic shift that he lived through. In his narrative, the image of free Czechoslovakia turned into the description of an ugly and prison-like waiting room at a railway station. And when I read it, I was struck by the fact that this is not a description of a real place. Waiting rooms in stations are always ugly, I think. But I read this text as a symbolical expression of his profound surprise and disillusionment with democratic Czechoslovakia. And before being turned back to Austria, Berman managed to telegram the Czechoslovak president Edvard Beneš and appealed to the humanity of Czechoslovak democracy. And you can see the cable right over there. And I should add that Berman was personally known to Beneš. However, his telegram never reached the Czechoslovak president, and the document ended in the archives of the Czechoslovak Ministry of Interior with a remark roughly translated saying, "No action." Thus, Berman, instead of being granted asylum, to which he referred when he talked about humanity of Czechoslovak democracy, he was treated as an unwelcome Jewish economic migrant. This event is one of the many, many illustrations of the new policy of closed borders for Jewish refugees, a policy which is in place in most of Europe after the Anschluss of Austria, when European states fear the influx of a large number Austrian, but also other Jews, and it is a symbolical introduction into the period of ethnic categorization of refugees, and specifically exclusion of those who were considered to be Jewish. Until 1937, crossing borders was not the main challenge for most refugees from Nazi Germany. They found it difficult to find a stable refuge, to legalize their residence, to obtain a labor permit, be it in France or Czechoslovakia or Denmark or Yugoslavia. However, as a result of the radicalization of Nazi anti-Jewish policy of exclusion and expulsion, Jews from Germany and later from other occupied countries were increasingly perceived not as refugees, but as economic migrants, which translates to unwanted and translates to Jewish in the context of this period. Moreover, refugees were seen as harbingers of something beyond just competition on the labor market or just a challenge to the social system of the receiving state. For nation states like Czechoslovakia or Poland in and around 1938, they became or were considered an existential topic, something to which I will return later on. Now, after the Anschluss of Austria, Czechoslovak officials, as well as Hungarian, Yugoslav, or Swiss officials, routinely refused entry to Jewish refugees from Austria. I was struck, when I started to do research on this, I was struck by one fact, and that is that unlike the Swiss reactions to the policy of closed borders, something that was subjected to profound criticism, profound analysis and criticism, especially starting with 1960s, informed by a kind of morally informed perspective on how Western liberal democracies should treat refugees, Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia or other states were not considered to be in the same league. Their policies were not analyzed in such a detail, as if it was not expected that someone would seek asylum in these countries, as if these countries were only places to leave rather than to stay. And I think the reality was much more complex, and I think these examples also call for more attention being devoted to refugees in the Second World War, before or after, in Eastern Europe. Now let me lead you to another case of no man's land. The extremes of the policy of sealed borders were illustrated in an extreme way on the fates of a group of Jews from two Burgenland towns, Jews who were brought by the Austrian SA across the Danube during one night in mid-April 1938. They were left standing on a kind of artificial island on the Danube, on the Czechoslovak side of the Danube. In the morning, Czechoslovak officials found them. They helped them, fed them, sent one sick woman to hospital, and then returned them to the Austrian side. And then the Austrians did the same and sent them across the Hungarian borders, where the story was repeated again. The group was sent to a very humiliating form of forced labor and was surviving in the region where the borders of the three states met. Eventually, because of their dire situation, the Bratislava Pressburg Jewish community found the only solution that was available to them and accommodated them on a towboat that was anchored on the Hungarian side of the Danube, which counted as international waters. It took 3 to 4 months, during which none of the three states around was willing to provide even a temporary refuge. It took 3 to 4 months to arrange their emigration overseas, mostly to Palestine and to the United States. And again, it was Šmolka who visited the ship and reported from there. And I must say, I've started my research at the JDC archives yesterday, and in the couple of hours, I already found one copy of Šmolka's report about the towboat, and I'm looking forward to compare it with the other copies that I have. But it's also worth mentioning because the archives of relief organizations in the West are very often the only place where such reports have survived, since the local relief organizations, such as HISEM, for which Šmolka worked, these organizations destroyed their archives when the Nazis arrived. Their first hours of occupation were typically filled by burning files of their clients in order not to compromise them. And Šmolka writes in her report about their indescribable spiritual suffering, which was increased by their physical suffering caused by the stay in small storage rooms of the towboat, rooms that are riddled by rats, or stay on the deck, exposed to foul weather as well as to sweltering sun. And as you can see, I'm collecting the cases of the no man's land and trying to create a broader view of its geography. Now, before we move to the other case that I want to discuss, we need to understand that so far the restrictions, the sealed borders that I've described, were meant for foreigners. Jews with Czechoslovak passports coming to Czechoslovak borders would be let in. And the same thing, as well as Polish Jews, if they had passports and coming to Polish borders, they would have the right to come back to their original country. However, with the next stage, another chapter of the no man's land begins, which goes beyond the border closure for foreigners, the refusal of the reception of the citizens of these countries if they happen to be or were considered Jews. And this is the case after the Munich Agreement at the end of September 1938, through which Czechoslovakia was forced to cede its border areas to Nazi Germany, an event which triggered a large wave of refugees, most of whom were not Jewish. Most of them were considered to be ethnic Czechs. Some of them were Germans, and some, probably about 20,000 of them, were considered as Jews. And you can see how I balance when I'm talking about these ethnic categories, and I'm trying always to stress that they were considered, because the element of ethnic ascription, the very phenomenon of dividing refugees into ethnic categories, is new and very characteristic of 1938. And we should be very cautious when referring to these categories and using the statistics that were developed by officials at this time. So after the Munich Agreement, while Czechs were welcome in this smaller, humiliated, nationalist and anti-Semitic Czechoslovakia, while Czechs were welcome, some Sudeten Germans were sent back into the disputed parts of the territory, and Jewish refugees were returned or stopped on the border, and this was happening especially after the Kristallnacht. The photograph that you can see there is one of many cases of the no man's land on the new demarcation line. The demarcation line is in the interrupted black line. This one. So I have marked just several ones to which I have documents already, but I'm certain that there were many other cases. This photograph is from southern Moravia, from a place which is not absolutely clear to me, but and again you can see this is a group of people who built some kind of improvised tent just close to a road. They were certainly, very probably they could see the border guards of both countries from where they were standing. So 50 meters to the right there would be Czechoslovak officials, 50 meters in the other directions there would be German or other Austrian border guards. It is very well possible that people on this photograph, whose identity I do not know, that these people would end up in another form of the no man's land, in an internment camp that was quickly erected by a Jewish refugee committee in a place called Ivančice or Eibenschütz in German. This was a more permanent or long-term version of the no man's land, which became a camp not only for refugees, but later on also for, in the Protectorate Bohemia and Moravia, for Jews who were stateless or for foreign Jews. All of them would be, or a lot of them would be forced into this camp, which was in existence until the deportations in 1941, and whereas at the beginning it was a place of support created by the Jewish aid organization in Brno, later on it was controlled by the Nazi authorities in the Protectorate. This is a form with photographs of the inmates of this camp. The forms were made for the purpose of emigration. At this stage of my research, I actually do not know if these people succeeded in their emigration efforts or if they were deported later. The last case of the no man's land which I want to mention is the one which is the best known. It's the expulsion of Polish Jews from Germany in October 1938, when approximately 20,000 of them within 2 or 3 days were brought by the German police and by the Gestapo to the Polish border. And it is a series, for reasons that I will explain later, and it is a series of events that is very often described as first deportations and also as a prehistory to the Kristallnacht. But they're very often the expulsion is not explained in the context of the no man's land for refugees throughout 1938. And again, for time reasons, I'm not going to refer to Zbonsin here in more detail, although it would be very interesting also from the perspective of joint, since this was the moment when Joint became very intensely involved in direct assistance to refugees, and when Joint people, among them Emanuel Ringelblum, themselves organized direct help and the life in the camp in Zbonsin. And this expulsion was taking place just a couple of days before the expulsion of Slovak Jews, which I've discussed just at the very beginning of this lecture. Now, the no man's land could take different forms, where it was linked to territorial revisions, as in the case of expulsions from Sudetenland and from Slovakia, and where the demarcation lines between the posts of the states were still improvised and sometimes in flux. There, refugees would find themselves literally in the open, camping on a field or just along a road. On a more established border, or after the stay in the space between the bayonets of policemen or soldiers, refugees would often be interned within the border zone, for instance, in the town of Zbonsin, or in the less known case of the southern Moravian town of Ivančice. Such instances of the no man's land later on tended to turn into regular internment camps that were more durable and existed for months or even years. Now, this is the geography of the refugee no man's land that I've collected so far. And I would like to offer 2 remarks at this stage. One is the geography is by far not complete. We could certainly add cases on the southern Austrian border, on the Austrian-Yugoslav border, or, for instance, there were cases of the no man's land in 1939 after the occupation of Poland on its eastern border, so that I'm still in the middle of my research, and I will strive to provide a more complete mapping of the no man's land for refugees over time. The other remark relates to the recent trend in Holocaust research, specifically about Holocaust geographies. This is a very vivid, very promising research field with several interesting publications. For instance, recent Tim Cole's, which I've read with huge interest. Yet, this research, it seems to me, not only that it doesn't include the refugee no man's land, my very narrow topic, although I think it's important, but it also doesn't include refugee geography. And I do believe that thinking about geography of refugees, the spaces in which interactions between refugees and states and aid organizations take place, that this would be a very important extension to this research about Holocaust geography. Now, when I was reading through my sources, I was struck not only by the very proliferation of the term no man's land, or Niemandsland in German, or in Czech, for instance, Země nikoho, but I found it interesting that it comes as something almost self-evident. Everybody understands what it means, that there is a no man's land. And I found it, and I still find it, troubling and perplexing. It is, of course, easy to argue that the term no man's land refers to the First World War. It became widespread as a reflection of the soldier experience between the front lines of European armies during the First World War, especially between the trenches of the Western Front. It would appear that it is being mediated by cultural representation, because the territory about which we speak here was not the typical territory. That was not the West Front, that was the Eastern Front, and the war looked differently, and it was, in the First World War, a space much less likely to create no man's land between front lines, at least not comparable to the Western Front. It is clear that the term referred to the state of lawlessness, lack of rules, exclusion that was experienced by soldiers who were trapped between the lines. For refugees in 1938, it wasn't only a description of a piece of land next to a road or a makeshift camp, but figuratively encompassed the situation when no state would take responsibility and provide protection for these human beings. Its occurrence, therefore, was symbolic for the broader erosion, the process of erosion of Jewish citizenship in East Central Europe. And I would like to, at the end of my talk, I'd like to offer some broader perspectives that refer less to the physical no man's land, but more to its broader meanings. And to understand this, I'd like to make a very simple, almost self-evident experiment with the map that I've collected, and namely to place these, the cases of no man's land on top of a map of pre-1918 map of East Central Europe, the time before the breakdown of empires and before the creation of the new nation states. As you can see, obviously, none of the borders that outlined the no man's land in 1938, none of them were in place before 1918. Oops. The new borders were cut out of the pre-First World War empires, especially the multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire. These borders ran through territory with a mixed population, a population mixed in terms of language and religion, culture. And the border zones in which refugees were hunted down or trapped in the no man's land, in almost all cases sported insecure or contested ethnic national identities and were subject to national tensions. Thus, I would argue that the crisis of 1938 brought back many of the unresolved problems and contradictions of 1918, embedded at the very core of the existence of these nation states. Needless to say that some of these contested territories and stages for the refugee no man's land also became subject of territorial revisions in 1938. Sorry. I refer here especially to the territorial revisions related to Sudetenland, to southern Slovakia, but we could also consider Austria as one territorial revision. These revisions and the refugees brought back with new strengths and renewed validity questions of national belonging, loyalty, and citizenship. And I believe that's where my research about the no man's land is related to new research about territorial disputes and nation states and Jewish loyalties in the Holocaust. For instance, the historian Holy Case stressed the significance of these topics for the course of the Holocaust on the example of Hungary and Romania, and James Ward, in a slightly different form, pointed out the significance of the First Vienna Accord in shaping the Slovak anti-Jewish policy and shaping the course of the Holocaust in Slovakia. So this recent research can be productively combined with the growing interest in borderlands and their complex societies, loyalties of their inhabitants, and the very fluidity of the meaning of their border lines. The improvised campings, as well as the more developed camps, became all part of the dynamic but also fluid border zones characterized by intensive social and economic connections across the border, but also they were a space where citizenship, ethnic identity, and nationality were negotiated, contested, and performed. And as demonstrated, for instance, by Caitlin Murdoch, the borderland concepts and visions often influence statewide nationalist propaganda and state policies. Therefore, the divisions that were outlined, defined on the border, and very powerfully performed at the border and reported about by journalists and others from the border, these divisions, these forms of exclusion also referred to divisions within the body of citizens and were related to trends towards new concepts of citizenship based on ethno-national community. The second and concluding remark that I want to make is related to revisions of citizenship in Poland and Czechoslovakia that were introduced as a result of the policy against Jewish refugees in 1938. Denaturalizations of Jews and also of political opponents have a long history. And I, again, do not have a space to refer to it completely, but apparently we know that the policies of Nazi Germany provided an influential model based on the citizenship law of July 1933. German officials were busy revising citizenship on two tracks. First, by stripping citizenship of well-known immigrants, and second, by well-known immigrants. And second, by denaturalizing mainly so-called Eastern Jews who were given German citizenship between 1918 and 1933. The very exclusionary dynamic of 1938 can be measured on the series of revisions of citizenship in the nation states eastern of Germany. In January 1938, Romanian government ordered a revision of Jewish citizenship that was designed to undo the more inclusive citizenship rules of the late 1920s, which forced Romania to accept citizenship based on territorial principle. While the revision of citizenship, while started by the pro-fascist government of Octavian Goga, the revision continued even after the demise of this government and eventually resulted into the denaturalization of approximately 250,000 Jews in Romania. Soon thereafter, the Anschluss of Austria provided a pretext for a revision of Polish citizenship along ethno-national lines. A significant proportion of Jews expelled from Austria and brought illegally across the border were Jews with Polish citizenship. Mostly refugees from the First World War, people who never succeeded to acquire Austrian citizenship. These people were very often coming either semi-voluntarily or they were basically expelled. They were coming to the Czechoslovak border. Czechoslovak officials were first sending them back, but then they realized that it was more practical to send them under guard to Polish border. Perhaps some 5,000 Polish Jews were transported through Czechoslovakia in this way. At the end of March 1938, the Polish parliament adopted a law providing for a revision of citizenship of people living abroad and engaging in anti-Polish activity, or losing connection to the Polish state, or failing to enter Poland for more than 5 years. And under the cover of the discussion about political refugees, it was still clear to everyone that the real aim of the law was the denaturalization of Polish Jews who were living in Germany, Austria, or in other countries. The law and the consequent Polish steps to examine the passports of Polish Jews living in Germany provided the Nazis with a pretext for the large-scale expulsion in October 1938. The law was passed as an immediate reaction to the influx of Jews from Austria after the Anschluss, yet, as convincingly argued by Jerzy Tomaszewski, it was prepared earlier, probably in 1937, in the consular section of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, by Viktor Tomin-Trimmer and his collaborators, a group of people who favored the vision of a more ethnically homogeneous Poland, binding citizenship to ethnicity and promoting Jewish emigration. Now, in January 1939, Czechoslovakia followed with a government decree revising citizenship of inhabitants who lived in Sudetenland before the Munich Agreement and some other categories of people, and the decree stipulated ethnicity as one of the key elements in deciding about citizenship, namely Czechs, Slovaks, and Subcarpathian Russians. The Slavic nations were excluded from the citizenship. The Germans were out of reach because of the power of Nazi Germany, so that it was clear to everyone that Jews are the real target of the law. The Czechoslovak authorities in the spring and into summer 1939 routinely denaturalized Jewish refugees from Sudetenland. This denaturalization decree was I haven't found any documents that would explain how the officials were thinking about it when they enacted it. But I believe that they saw it as a quick fix to what they perceived as imperfections of the right to opt as agreed between Nazi Germany and Czechoslovakia after the Munich Agreement. The right to opt was basically the right to choose between citizenship of two countries in the process of territorial revisions, and it was pretty usual after the First World War. This particular optation treaty, while building up on the post-First World War treaties, it dramatically changed the post-First World War practices in two ways. One, first, it was hardly voluntary. It was done under coercion. And second, there was a telling contradiction between the Czechoslovak and Nazi interpretation of the right to opt, whereas the German side based the right on racial rules and excluded Jews from citizenship. Czechoslovak rules were less clear and at least theoretically made it possible for Jews to claim Czechoslovak citizenship. Under the conditions of this post-Munich agreement, Sudeten Jews who acquired automatically Reich German citizenship, that is, if they or their parents lived in Sudetenland before 1910, they had the right to opt for Czechoslovak citizenship because they were not of German nationality as considered, as understood in Nazi Germany. And this was the group of people whom Czechoslovak officials wanted to prevent from coming. Thus, in both Polish and Czechoslovak cases, the refugees with the country's citizenship became an incentive or pretext to revise citizenship along ethno-national lines. If such refugees who were considered foreign based on ethnic categorization and nationalization politics, as well as based on destabilization of borders, if they were citizens, then the rules of citizenship were ultimately to be rewritten. Moreover, since citizenship is defined both by exclusion but also by inclusive rules and practices, the exclusionary policies towards the marginalized groups of Jews had also impact on the position of local, naturalized, and seemingly safe Jewish communities. And it was not a big surprise that in both countries, Jewish organizations feared that the denaturalization of Jews living outside of the borders would be only the first steps into the further exclusion of Jewish citizens. Thus, to come to a conclusion, which I will compress a little bit because of time reasons, I think what we see in 1938 is that the exclusionary policies that were the exclusionary policies that were first tested on refugees became replicated, became the basis for the persecution, for the exclusion, for the stripping of rights of other Jewish communities and Jewish citizens in these countries. This process, this is an interplay between the nationalizing policies of states such as Poland, such as Czechoslovakia or others, and Nazi Germany. And at the end of the day, it is difficult to draw a line between who is a refugee and who is citizen. Thus, the policies against against Jewish refugees contribute very seriously to the very erosion of Jewish citizenship in the region. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Dr. Frankl for this window on 1938 and a little microcosm of what was happening as Jews from Germany and Austria were either expelled or trying to escape Nazism, and a presage of what was to come. Thank you very much for this wonderful analysis. We're now going to entertain questions, please. Yes, sir?
Hello. She gave me the microphone.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk. I need a little clarification if you can. No man's land seems singular, but all of those red marks, do they represent small little enclaves of refugee camps?
Thank you for the question. These red dots are very different in their nature. Some of these are just a place along a road. Some of them are camps, such as Bonšin or Ivančice. Some of them are long-lived, in terms existing for several months or even years. Some of them are in existence just for a couple of days. before people make it into the interior of the country.
So they're really stopping off places, persons who were traveling to try to escape, and sometimes they couldn't make it or whatever. But it's a little confusing what they meant in terms of your concept of no man's land. It seems it was like one little section, but actually it's all of these places all over Europe. That's the way I'm reading it. Maybe I didn't understand it.
If I could add, think of it in terms of people leaving the German or Austrian border behind and trying to get into the next country, and these are places where refugees congregated on a route to try to escape, but to get into another country.
Let me just add to this. This is apparently not an exhaustive list of places where Jews were stranded somewhere on the border, but I'm persuaded that it is an important list. And the no man's land was not so self-evident. It was not an experience of most refugees before 1938 and also of most refugees afterwards. It is something which is very typical for this dramatic shift in dramatic territorial shifts and changes in understanding of citizenship in specifically this region. And that's why it's much more present in East Central Europe than in the West. You can find some cases on the French or Belgium or Dutch border, but they're very, very limited.
Yeah. I have a question about your earlier map. Can you go back to the earlier map? Keep going. No, keep going. Go.
It's slower than me.
Go. Yeah. Yeah. Well.
Which one? This one? No, this is.
No, earlier, because you have a map there which could not be contemporaneous. Maybe it's that one which is covered because you've got a list of all of the concentration camps in 1938, and some of them have skulls and some of them don't. Are the skulls the purely extermination camps and the other ones just worker extermination camps, a combination? Because I didn't understand that. You see the skulls on Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz. Yeah, could you go back to that on the map?
Yeah.
And you also have... No,
thank you for the remark.
And you also have Lidice on the map. Now, the only importance of Lidice, which was a small village, was that they were wiped out when Heydrich was killed. So I'm wondering why Lidice is on that map.
Yeah. This is a very simple answer, and that's it is rather difficult to get maps as a historian that are usable, that you can use in this form, so that I made a use of a map which captures which has the post-Munich borders, but also includes the later concentration camps. I should have mentioned this before. They have no direct significance for the story which I told here.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for a very intelligent and comprehensive presentation. There are very complex issues of identity and citizenship and borders, and that both predate World War I and continue until today. And naturally, since you're based in Prague, your focus in your research has primarily apparently been in Czechoslovakia. So my question is whether there are other scholars who have adopted your same strategy or point of view, who are focusing on other countries along the borders, like Hungary, the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania even?
Thank you for your question. And it's a great question. First of all, I'm trying to not to focus only on Czechoslovakia, but the core of my current research project are expulsions of Jews from Austria, from Sudetenland into southern Slovakia, and the expulsion of Polish Jews. So it's a more international research. Clearly, it still captures only part of East Central Europe. And I do agree that it is very important to build to extend this research into the other countries. There are several interesting recent studies about, for instance, Poland, Jerzy Tomaszewski about the Zboncin case, or if I should name one, by Kinga Froimowicz about Hungary. And I would very much like to build a broader comparative project about East Central Europe, provided there's funding for that.
I'll add thanks to everyone else's thanks for your thoughtful and detailed talk. But my question is, do you have any thoughts, there's nothing you can prove, about the impact or even existence of the whole no man's land phenomenon had the Austro-Hungarian Empire not collapsed and the map of Europe been redrawn post-World War I? Like, what might this have meant or been if that had not happened? I'm just curious about the relative influence of the German invasions versus the sort of collapse of the European order.
I guess you want to engage me in counterfactual history. Because my line of argument was the reverse one, and that is these cases of no man's land were possible because of the creation of the nation states. And they signaled their insecurities, their problems, the way these nation states were being threatened by the international development in 1938, territorially, but also in the very in other ways. I think it is very difficult to conceptualize what would have happened if the Habsburg monarchy was still in place, because I can hardly imagine a course of history which would lead to Nazi Germany and its expansion at the same time.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the refugee ship that's sitting there on the border. Is that like a ship that's sitting on the Danube, for example, where refugees were congregating? Or is that the name of the town?
It is the group of approximately 60 Jews from Burgenland, which I've mentioned earlier in my talk. It was a group of people from small children up to Rabbi Perls, who was over 80, and his wife, those who were brought across the Danube by Austrian SA, if you can remember this case. And they were living on the on this ship. I didn't know how to best name it so that it fits the small space on the map, so I described it as a refugee ship. In fact, these were two ships, where the first one was very small and crowded, so that the Jewish community in Bratislava eventually found a better, somewhat larger one. And refugees were really living for several months on this ship in very crowded conditions. There are reports that one person, for instance, died when trying to escape, trying to swim across the Danube. The ship was anchored on the Hungarian side of Danube, close to the town of Rijeka, and eventually it was the Hungarian government which forced the Jewish organizations, including the Joint, to find ways for these people to emigrate, either by providing the so-called capitalist certificates for Palestine, or to find affidavits for people who had relatives in the United States.
Refugee itself, somewhat noted in this context, in that these, in many cases, were people who've been expelled, and English doesn't even really necessarily have a good word for it, but refugee doesn't quite capture it either.
I do agree, and I think this set of events is, especially this Zboncin case, the expulsion of Polish Jews, is very often referred to as the first deportation, and the chain of events is described by several historians as a process from expulsion to deportation. Especially Wolf Gruner can trace these connections very well between the policy of bringing people to border and bringing them to ghettos or camps later on. But what I was trying to do here was to show that there is even a broader context to it, that by bringing someone to the border, I also I create new borders within the society of citizens in my country or in the other country. And I think you're absolutely right. We do not have vocabulary for this because it's a period which blurs the vocabulary. Refugee or citizen, it's the difference is blurred. Refugee or deportee as well.
I think you're on to something. I really do. My question is this, is the development of the concept of no man's land and the reactions, let's say, of the various governments outside of Nazi Germany to this problem. A reaction, strictly speaking, to this sudden appearance of people, however we call them, refugees or whatever. Or is there something that's developing earlier in the 1930s in response to, first of all, the rise of the Nazi regime, and secondly, to the various economic autocracies, for example, in Eastern Europe?
Thank you for the question. I'll take about 2 hours to answer it, right? You are absolutely right. I've compressed the presentation and limited it to 1938 to highlight the dramatic shift. But I would argue that the phenomenon of the no man's land is new. And it is in contrast to what you see before 1938. And as I mentioned earlier, before that, most refugees do not find it difficult to cross the border. You can come to France, you can come to Czechoslovakia as a Jew. Your problem is not to come, but to stay. So that's answer number one. Answer number two is apparently you can see developments in the second half of the 1930s that point already to the exclusion of Jewish refugees. For instance, after the introduction of Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany, as well as because of difficulties of immigration to Palestine, Jewish refugees are increasingly seen not as refugees but as migrants. This is the case of Czechoslovakia, for instance, and Czechoslovakia was more liberal than the other states in the East. In 1936, Czechoslovak Ministry of Interior and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs sends out decrees, circulars to the effect that even German Jews holding German passports, are not to be understood as refugees, but as migrants. It is up to the officials to really judge whether the person would fall into this or that category. And the categories were very much in flux. Thus, I think it's very interesting. They provided a lot of freedom to officials, policemen or district captains. And this was also an invitation to deploy their own personal prejudice. If the person was prejudiced against Jews or against Jews whom they understood as Eastern, uncultivated, non-belonging Jews, they had easier tools to exclude them. So that yes, it is a longer process, and that's why it comes so self-evident in 1938 for many to just seal the border and stop these people. But it is happening on this level only in 1938. Thank you for this question. I would really like to know, but I can give you some estimates. The largest case apparently is the expulsion of Polish Jews from Germany. That's the best known, where this could have affected up to approximately 20,000 people. The deportation of Slovak Jews is more than 7,000 people. Most of them eventually return, are allowed to return to Poland. The cases on the Sudetenland border, that is very difficult to say. Mostly, it is a couple of people, dozen of people, a couple of families who live somewhere next to a road. And I'm not able to come up with statistics. The largest case was Ivančice, which was about hundreds of people.
I think we have time for about one more question. Yes.
Thank you for this question. I think I'll start with the second one, although I also find it difficult to answer. First of all, these people often had passports. The problem was that the validity of these passports was questioned. It was not so much the identity. It was not a problem to have an ID that testifies to who you are, but you miss a piece of paper that tells where you belong to officially. And when Polish Jews were deported from Germany to the Polish border, they actually were still officially Polish citizens because it was just before the deadline. So theoretically, they had perfectly valid Polish passports in their hands. And if I can add one remark, which is vaguely related to your question, it is a period where we see increasingly questioned validity of passport, even for passports that are perfectly okay from the formal point of view, but there are rumors circling between ministries of Interior and Foreign Affairs that Jewish passports of Romania or this country or that country are not valid without a special stamp or special remark. For instance, this passport is valid for return to Romania. It, I think, testifies to the very erosion of citizenship in these countries, and possibly not only Jewish citizenship, which would be for a longer discussion. Apparently, people were carrying other IDs. It's a period of introduction of ID cards, internal ID cards, that are not that well known in the US, but are very well known in European states. They had labor books and all kinds of cards that they used to, sometimes even to cross borders. It is, by the way, interesting that immediately after the Anschluss of Austria, the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs issues a ban on return of Polish citizens without valid passports, thus preventing that they come with other IDs, and they also systematically refuse to issue such passports to Jews in Austria or elsewhere. The first question, I think, was not so much a question, and I think I've also referred to the questions of 1918, and yes, I do agree that what we see in 1938 reopens the post-First World War problems with who belongs where. It can be very well illustrated on the fact that Polish Jews living in Austria or living in Germany were not very successful in receiving the citizenship of this country. There's a lot of research about this for both countries. and I do not want to. I think it would take us all too much time right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Frankl.
Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed our program today and want to thank you for coming. I want to extend thanks to Joel Levy, Chris Bartel, and Julie Frank for the Center for Jewish History for co-sponsoring this program today. And I'd like to draw your attention to some of the printed material on the registration table. Please take a look at our centennial book, at our brochure about the fellowship, and sign up for our e-newsletter. Our website is archives.jdc.org. Thank you very much.